This is Duke University.
So Atlantic hurricane season, it officially begins on June 1st. But this year, the first tropical storm, which was called Tropical Storm Arlene, it formed in April. Then in August, I'm sure you all remember, we had Hurricane Harvey, which broke rainfall records, and it soaked some parts of Texas with more than 50 inches of rain. And then we had Hurricane Irma, which hit countries in the Caribbean, and it hit Florida, and it was one of the strongest hurricanes on record in the Atlantic. Then we had Maria, which of course was catastrophic in Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands and in other places in the Caribbean. And then we had Ophelia, which hit Ireland. And then we had something just recently called a Medicane, which is something that looks a lot like a tropical cyclone, but it forms in the Mediterranean. And that hit Greece the week before Thanksgiving, creating rainfall that the mayor of Athens, actually the city near Athens, called biblical. So what's going on? We're here today to hear from our two experts about, was there actually something new or strange or different or weird about this hurricane season? What does this hurricane season tell us about the future? And is there anything that we can do about it? So I'm going to start with Dr. Lozier. You're a physical oceanographer, so I just want to start with the place of, in a nutshell, what is a physical oceanographer, and how does that relate to hurricanes?
So as a physical oceanographer, I study, quite simply, the physics of the ocean. So I'm interested in where the water goes and why. And so primarily my research focus is on large-scale oceanography. I study the ocean's response to climate. So I'm very interested in how the ocean is warming in response to climate, but more importantly, how the ocean takes up anthropogenic CO2. But as an oceanographer, I also have interests that include the hurricanes. And so hurricanes are largely impacted by the temperature of the ocean, and that's where my connection and my interest in large-scale oceanography intersects with hurricanes.
And Dr. Spurlock, you have wide-ranging research that focuses on the relationships among land use, the environment, human behavior, and structural inequality. So I was curious if you could explain in a nutshell how that relates to hurricanes.
So when I was first coming out of my master's program, I did a joint degree program with public health and city and regional planning, and I worked on a project where we were just looking at what is now known as social vulnerability. So the idea of the social complexities of our society, of our institutions that place people at higher risk. I started this project probably summer of 2015, so July. I'm making a lot of phone calls. We were funded by Congress, kind of motivated by Hurricane Isabel. However, during that recruitment period, as we're talking to communities, Hurricane Katrina makes landfall, which changes the dynamic. Why land use is so incredibly important when we think about hurricanes is, one, we see the destruction and the loss of life, so destruction of private property or property and the loss of life. But for me, it's also throwing into sharp relief the inequalities we see in our society. What we see in everyday life, people who have difficulty with transportation, getting to various activities of daily life, with the disruption that comes with a hurricane, it's exacerbated. It opens up a window to have a discussion about public policy where we could actually sharpen our focus on rectifying a lot of these inequalities.
It sounds like you're saying when a hurricane comes through, that exposes our weaknesses.
Yes, it lays them quite bare, whether it is with food insecurity, whether it's with where we're building and the intensity that we're building, whether we're talking about historic discrimination that affects whether or not, we'll talk about insurance, whether or not folks can be even insured by the big three, so which were the big three, therefore more likely to actually see a payout. So all of those different societal structures are in place and they're working behind the scenes. However, with any natural hazard that becomes a disaster, it lays those inequalities bare.
What can you tell us about the relationship between climate change and hurricanes?
Yeah. So the type of hurricanes that we saw this past the end of August and the beginning of September, so Harvey, Irma, Maria, those are the type of hurricanes that we can expect as our world continues to warm. But we can't at this point make any attribution of those to climate change. And I'll give you reasons why. So first, why do we expect, or how do we expect hurricanes to change in the decades ahead? So as the atmosphere warms, the ocean will warm. The ocean is really heated, from above. And not only have we seen atmospheric warming, but we have seen ocean warming as well. In fact, 90% of the warming has been in the ocean. The ocean has a huge heat capacity compared to the atmosphere. So a lot of attention has been paid to the atmosphere, but most of that warming has been evident in the ocean. Now, hurricanes are fueled by warm water. This is why hurricanes are formed in the tropical Atlantic. They're fueled, they get their energy by the warm water, and we know that when they move into colder water, they decrease, they dissipate, they die out, or when they move over land, they die out. But they're very dependent on having very warm water. So as we move forward, we expect hurricanes to be more intense because they will get more energy from that warm water. We also expect hurricanes to have more, what we say, precipitable water, meaning they will rain more, because a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. We all know this in terms of, in the summer, the air is more humid, it holds more water vapor because it's warmer. So those two things, just from basic physics and from models, we know that in the decades ahead, we're going to expect hurricanes to be more intense and rain more. Now, those changes, though, are not huge. So by running ensembles of models, climate researchers are able to quantify how large those changes will be. And by the end of the 21st century, they can say in all probability, we will have more intense hurricanes on the order of 10 to 15%, and we will have more rainfall on the order of somewhere around 5 to 10%. So we're not talking about a doubling of the intensity or tripling, of the rainfall, but we do expect those changes to occur. Now, right now, though, if we took all of the hurricanes, let's say of the past, or let's say in the 20th century, took all the hurricanes in the 20th century and put them in one group, and all of the hurricanes from the 21st century in another group, admittedly it's a smaller group, we wouldn't be able to find any difference between those groups right now. There's such a strong overlap between them that just judging by one hurricane, we wouldn't be able to figure that out. But in the decades ahead, we expect some separation in those groups, such that the more intense hurricanes then, we think then we would be able to pick out that it would stick out from the distribution, but we're not at that point yet. A lot of people, I'm a strong believer in climate change, but I'll say a lot of people who are strong believers in climate change almost want to believe that these hurricanes, that we can tag these as due to climate change. But we can't say that with any scientific credibility now. Hurricanes, if you don't mind, I'll just give 3 reasons why. One is hurricanes are extremely rare events. And so our record from which we can judge whether a hurricane has been impacted by the background climate, that record really begins in the late 70s to the early 80s. Prior to that, there are hurricanes that occurred out at sea. Satellites weren't able to see them. Places on the coast, we had, weather stations weren't there. We didn't have people living there. So our record of hurricanes, observed hurricanes, is really quite small. So, and also, they're rare, so we need many of them to come up with statistical confidence. The third thing to keep in mind is that they are dynamically complex. So unlike other climate change indicators, it's very difficult to figure out what about a hurricane we should be seeing now. So if we take sea level rise, so the physics of sea level rise is incredibly simple. If you warm water, it's going to expand and the sea will rise. Plus, the sea is always there to measure. And so what we understand about how the ocean sea level rise should respond to warming is very simple, and it's very easy to measure. The same thing with temperature. The ocean is always there to measure its temperature, and so is the atmosphere. And we know from first principles that if we increase greenhouse gases, we should expect a temperature rise. Sea ice melt, if we warm the Arctic, we should have sea ice melt. So there's very clear indicators of climate change, but the hurricanes are not so clear. it is not all that clear that just if you have a temperature increase that you will get stronger hurricanes. The wind shear matters. So this year in particular was a strong hurricane season because we had unusually large temperatures in the tropical Atlantic. We had a La Nina year, meaning no El Nino, and that means that we were not lopping off the top of the hurricanes because of strong wind shear. So there were factors unrelated to climate change that really made this hurricane season a strong one. Now, as we go forward in decades ahead, we expect to see those characteristics, but we can't say anything now about that Wilma or Irma or Harvey were related to climate change. Just one more thing related to something that Sara said. We've had two tropical cyclones in April. One was this past year that Sara just indicated. The other one was in 1851. So one is in 1851 and one is in 2017. Now, are we able to say anything based on those two facts about, April tropical cyclones? The other thing about Ophelia hitting Ireland, Ireland has been hit twice with hurricanes. Once was this year, and once was in 1961 by Hurricane Debbie. But you see, with those few events, we can't make any strong statements about whether what we saw today was an indication of climate change, given that we saw a tropical cyclone, in April. So the fact that a rare event sort of confounds our efforts to make a really clean attribution.
Do we know anything about whether in the future hurricane season could get longer?
Yeah, so the hurricane season is really set by the sea surface temperatures, and so that's why there's a delay. So we know that in terms of the season, we have our strongest warming at the summer solstice in June around June 21st, June 22nd. So you might think, well, it's odd that hurricane season runs from June 1st to November 1st, but it does so because there's a lag. It takes a while for the ocean, to heat up. So as oceans warm, we might expect then that we will lengthen this season. We will lengthen that hurricane season. But again, that's going to be a slow creep. I will say that when you look back over the historical record, we have not been able to find any change to date in the number of hurricanes. And in fact, moving forward, there isn't, from the models and predictions, it's not expected that there will be an increase in the number, but there'll be sort of a shift in the intensity.
So we won't necessarily have 20 hurricanes attacking the coast, but we might have a few that are more intense.
Okay. Yeah.
So I was, a few weeks ago, there was a really interesting study that came out from Kerry Emanuel that I don't know if you've had a chance to see it. Mm-hmm. And the journalists like me jumped all over it because he was suggesting that hurricanes like Harvey were 6 times more likely to occur now than they were in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you wanted to comment on that study.
Yeah. So moving ahead, he is saying that hurricanes like Harvey, will be, it's sort of what I said before. Uh-huh. So moving forward, we will be more likely to have hurricanes like Harvey than we are in the 20th century. But I will say that, but again, what he's doing is, he's dealing in probabilities. Mm-hmm. So he's not saying that Hurricane Harvey is the result of climate change, right? So in other words, as we move forward, we will be more likely to have more intense hurricanes and those with more precipitation. I will say something about Hurricane Harvey, which I think is interesting. Sara did note that it had a record of 51 inches. Now part of that, as many of you know, that Hurricane Harvey stalled, and half of it was sitting over the Gulf, and half of it was sitting over Houston, which was really ended up being bad news for Houston. So it stalled because there was a high pressure system that was blocking it from moving onshore. And what's really detrimental about these hurricanes is when they stall, because then the surrounding area just gets drenched. But in this case, it was particularly disadvantaged. Houston was disadvantaged because half the hurricane was sitting there over the Gulf of Mexico, so it was eventually being recharged with precipitation, leading to a really enormously large rainfall of 51 inches. That said, in 1948, Camille was 48, had somewhere 40-something inches. So we can't, as much as people try, the climate scientists, we can't see records from or we can't see trends in our observational records in terms of even rainfall and occurrences. But moving forward, we do expect to see those changes.
And I really respect scientists so much for saying, well, we just don't know yet, or we can't yet see a trend emerging from the data.
Right.
Are there still lessons that we ought to take from this season that we have just witnessed?
Well, if we say that these are the type of hurricanes we can expect, and I'll let Danielle talk about the lessons in terms of where we should build, et cetera. What I would say is the bigger lessons that we have about climate change, I think we need to look at the sea level rise, which is very evident, in many places around the globe, about the Arctic sea ice, about the warming in the ocean, the warming in the atmosphere, the warming in the CO2. So many people, I guess because the hurricanes are so dramatic, so there is a very strong desire to make the case of climate change I'm going to say on the backs of hurricanes. But to me, the far simpler case, is, to step away and say, we've got plenty of evidence that there's climate change occurring across the globe. With the physics we understand, the trends we can see developing. But the message for hurricanes, I think even a strong message has to do with an economic message that's also tied in with the sea level rise, that we should seriously reconsider what we're doing in terms of the insurance and rebuilding along the coast. So the lesson is that we do expect to have hurricanes like this in the future, so we should expect to plan for them, but we can say that without saying these are the result of hurricanes. Yeah, and I know people often really want me to say, yes, these are the result of climate change, but there's a danger in that. I don't know how many of you were here in the area in 2005 or 2006, and we had quite a drought in this area, prolonged drought for about 18 months. And many people were attributing that drought to climate change, and they were saying, well, this is what the Southeast, can expect. But in fact, the climate models have not yet come to agreement about whether we are going to have more or less rain here in the Southeast. But that drought was taken by by some as a sign of climate change. But in fact, it wasn't really anomalous precipitation that was driving that drought. It's just that this area had really built up quite a bit in the 1990s and in the early part of the 20th century. And a drought, that quantification of a drought takes into account water usage. We had really unusually high water usage. So yes, the reservoirs, everything was down. We were below normal in precipitation, but nothing, that was really very unusual. And so we sort of learned a lesson there in that call, basically some people lost some scientific credibility there by, calling something that was climate change. And I think this gets back to the question or the issue that was raised earlier. I think it's very important for us to be I think maintaining scientific credibility on these issues is incredibly important, because I do think that if we rush to name all of these events as climate change and lose that credibility, I think that's really damaging to the overall message of what we're trying to say about the impacts we have, on this globe.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Dr. Spurlock, I wanted to ask you a similar question of what sorts of lessons do you think we can take from this season for our society?
Again, I want to echo Dr. Lozier in saying that I'm a firm climate change believer, but we don't have the data. And however, from a public policy standpoint for preparing for hurricanes, I don't know that we need to make that linkage. We need to take action based on the repeated loss of life and damage that we've seen, and change what our actual development patterns are. The example I'll give is from a 1965 Hurricane Betsy. Hurricane Betsy hit Louisiana quite hard. It was $1 billion in 1965 worth of damage. This is the beginning of when we're actually setting the hurricane record as from June 1st to November 30th. And in 1966, and it's hard because it's my profession that does this, they're making choices in their land use plan to increase the population within the levees, placing them at risk by 250,000 people. They have a very recent catastrophic event that they're still recovering for as they create this land use plan, and yet it's still seen as a driver, partially, quite unfortunately, some people see it as a driver forward. Oh, they've cleared out entire sections of our community. We can now develop them in a different manner versus having to raise them through the development process. But more troubling is it really is a very clear example of what we call in planning the safe development paradox. The safe development paradox stems from doing a lot of engineering around the levee system, particularly there's a number of really interesting tools that will show you interactively how the levee system increases the damage that we see from Hurricane Katrina. Once those levees are overtopped, they retain water within the city. The canal systems channel water to different neighborhoods. All of this is built after Hurricane Betsy has shown that particular parts of eastern New Orleans is particularly vulnerable. So overall, what can we do is to take the lessons that are actually coming decades before, not even having to just look to what occurred in the 2005 hurricane season, but we have data and evidence from decades before that we have not yet used to shape our federal, state, and local policies around development. At the federal level, we see much more around risk reduction, so the levee systems, around engineering. We see risk sharing through the National Flood Insurance Program. But we don't have the same motivation to talk about risk elimination. And much of that risk elimination would be changing how we develop, changing when we know areas are in particular physically vulnerable, that we don't continue to, in many cases, incentivize development in those areas. Our developments, our cities around water bodies are some of the largest economic drivers in our country. And yet, we're not doing ourselves a service when we think of hurricanes as being so rare that they're going to be a large magnitude, but I don't have to worry about that decision or that possibility as I'm making decisions about where I'm going to place development, where I'm going to ask taxpayers to actually help safeguard some of that development through whether it's investment in engineering like levee systems, but also paying out after flood events.
So let's say I'm the mayor of Wilmington. What ought I to do different?
It's a difficult conversation because we're also, coastal development is driving the economies of a number of small towns, a number of counties, particularly in North Carolina, that were formerly Tier 1 counties. So counties where we are particularly concerned about economic development. Those are the same counties where the boom in vacation homes, the attraction of retirees is all wrapped up in development, and having anything, whether it's sea level rise modeling numbers that suggest that development could be placed at risk, then places my tax base at risk. And I am now thinking about, well, that's going to be a rare, large magnitude event, but I still need to provide services to my community on a day-to-day basis. So it's very easy psychologically to do that discounting. For the mayor to make those decisions, we have to support our elected officials in being able to push back from development pressures that are able to make those arguments that we can expand our tax base through these developments. We have to actually we want to hold our elected officials' feet to the fire by giving them the support to say, no, this isn't actually how we want to develop. that in many cases means for many communities, we're going to have hard conversations about growth, about the services that are provided, and are we going to have to rethink our municipal budgets?
Uh-huh.
That's a hard conversation.
Yes. And I think I want to ask you about what should we be doing in our cities, in our coastal communities, and even in places like Durham to protect the populations that are particularly vulnerable when natural disaster strikes?
A lot of that is, and that was the project we worked on in the shadow of Hurricane Katrina, is the actual involvement of folks in the planning process. So not trying to speak for them, speaking with them. Part of that is there's a bilateral exchange of information. One thing that struck me, we looked at 6 states in the District of Columbia that had been struck by Hurricane Isabel. What struck me over and over again was hurricane and emergency managers who live and breathe and are incredibly important to our response, but often being so tied to the data that they had control over that they weren't willing to listen to community folks. For example, the floodplain maps say it doesn't flood over here, so we're actually not going to take into account how that might shift our evacuation routes. Where you have community members saying, there's been a lot of development upstream that's not accounted for in some of these older floodplain maps. It is flooding a lot here. I can't actually go out the route that you've suggested I go out. Taking into account that people are preparing, but, and that's one thing that came out of a number of these, and the discussions we have in aftermaths, the assumption that marginalized communities aren't preparing. They're not preparing the way we've told if they would just have the checklist filled out. To a certain extent, yes, and that was actually being done by a lot of community members. Yet, if I ask the question, how did you prepare? And like, well, I didn't do anything. I'm like, okay, well, let's continue to have a conversation. Well, I made sure to run up water in my tub. I had pulled all the debris out of my yard. I made sure I stockpiled as much food as my budget would allow. I got all my important documents, put them in multiple plastic bags, and set them up high. I got batteries. It was actually a blind woman who told me this. I made sure I got batteries so that I would be able to compensate or do some kind of recognition and gratitude for those who would stand in line for me during recovery efforts. But when asked the question, do you prepare? Many folks from these communities were saying, I don't. And I think it's partially because of how we've constructed the definition of what preparedness looks like, particularly in the shadow of 9/11. People would, as we were talking to more people, as well, I don't have tarps pre-cut to fit my windows, so I'm not prepared. I don't have a generator, so I'm not prepared. What we need to do is thinking about how do we build social capital at the local level so that people who are preparing, but they can only prepare within their budget for 72 hours, but electricity is out in some places for weeks. How do we have plans that are robust to those different scenarios, that it's not just 72 hours that we expect people, and that people are prepared as much as their resources can allow, but we also have systems in place where it doesn't just fall to individuals to provide, that we've actually made some of those social linkages where resources can move through networks such that we're not just saying the one center will be over here. I think back at the water shortage that occurred in Chapel Hill this spring. I don't know how many people heard about that. Water was out for maybe 48 hours, and yet there were some usage issues that we were going to have to talk about as a community. But even how to respond to that was a bit stymied. The buses aren't running on the weekends. I can't necessarily get to the places where you are providing additional water. I haven't stockpiled as much because I am trying to balance my budget. We have to think to the extremes and test our plans to failure. When do our plans start breaking down and then work from there versus saying, well, where we can totally survive for 72 hours. What if it's much longer?
Yeah, I think there's such a frontier mentality, I think, that a lot of Americans have, that I need to be able to survive on my own. How do communities and people in this room help our elected officials start moving in the direction that you're suggesting?
It's a layered system, so there's always going to be a role for individual preparation. You know your needs and the needs of your household better than anyone else is going to. You're going to know what are the routes that are going to allow me to pick up any children I might have. If I'm doing elder care, how do I make sure that all of my household members have what they need? So there's always going to be this role of the household doing some level of preparation. And so there's always going to be a role for understanding what that preparation looks like. The role for, as we get up into government, is to think through how do we help people tie together when these outages are much longer than their household can buffer, as well as not consistently making decisions that place people at risk. Any flooding occurrence in Chapel Hill often hits a particular apartment complex. Part of what Chapel Hill can do is not necessarily being prepared to evacuate that apartment complex, which is what they're very ready to do, where you get notices that complex, they have boats, they're ready to pull people out. I would make the argument we have to provide affordable housing for people outside of those danger areas, outside of those vulnerable areas. Part of the reason why they're in these vulnerable areas is because the land is cheaper. That is where we've placed affordable housing. We've made that decision that affordable housing is either placed on cheap land and built new, or we'll let other housing become affordable by dilapidation. We have to have a different idea about how we provide housing at a range of different income levels in physical locations that are not as vulnerable to hurricanes or to flooding in general. And that's not at the individual level. That is a larger conversation at the municipal level, but also the state and federal level, as their incentive structures can shift how development occurs. So there are definitely proposals that would push our insurance premiums higher so that they reflect the risk, so all insurance is built on the idea of risk sharing. So we can't undercut that very fundamental premise of insurance. And yet the yearly premiums that are paid in are not commensurate with the amount that will be paid out based on disaster damage. So shifting those premiums to make some of those changes so that the actual pool of money is larger and is not necessarily going to have to come through appropriations. A more, I think, tenable situation might be the federal government has programs that if your community is doing certain types of planning, if they're taking on certain policies, it'll lower your insurance premiums. I'm all for that. What I think needs to shift is that the point system has to push people to make larger changes that actually change the landscape, actually change their land use development, opposed to saying, do you have a plan that does, that you have a response plan, it does these things. If you have a lot of low-hanging fruit where I can still get a large percentage off my insurance premium by not actually taking the larger steps that will reduce, not quite eliminate, but greatly reduce risk in a way that is possible. So we even the insurance structures can incentivize this continued development paradox where I've done just enough to reduce my premiums and when I say reduce premiums, it's the individual's premiums that are reduced, but it's because of local action. So what if we actually set those standards higher and provide the capacity building support to encourage communities that you still want to retain this percentage reduction, but we're going to ask more of you. We're not going to allow you to retain or to achieve this level of reduction with these less, with measures that really don't address the land use component.
Dr. Lozier, how good were the forecasts going into this 2017?
Actually, the forecasts this year were remarkably good. You may all remember that Hurricane Sandy, that the United States felt as though they had egg on their face. Our National Hurricane Center did, because the European Center, what's called the ECMWF, the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, really had a very nice prediction for Hurricane Sandy compared to our National Hurricane Center. So in the intervening 10 or 12 years, our National Hurricane Center has made a number of improvements, and in large part by relying much more heavily on an ensemble of models. So any one model has a lot of error inherent in the track and the prediction of the rain and intensity, but what they do is they use many different models and run them under many different initial conditions to get that cloud, that you see. So I know there were people that thought, why can't they figure out just exactly where in Florida, was that Irma, where it was moving, because it was projected to go into Miami and then actually ended up, moving over on the Tampa side. But it's actually pretty remarkable how they were able to get that path that close. So from the meteorological point of view, I think that the track accuracy was good. The thing that still remains very difficult is how much it's going to rain. And that it's also very difficult, or why it's very important to get that right is, as everybody knows, we categorize these hurricanes as 1 through 5 based on their intensity in terms of the winds. But actually, many of the hurricanes, particularly here in North Carolina, what's been most damaging is the amount of rain. So they are working on trying to come up with better predictions for the amount of rain. But that, of course, depends on the track and how much it stalls. But they feel as though there may be more preparations, because I know, like was it Matthew that hit last? Yeah, Hurricane Matthew was a Category 1 storm that hit eastern North Carolina last fall. Very little preparations went on because everybody said it was a Category 1 storm. Yes. But it had really historical flooding as a result of it. In fact, they're still recovering because of that. And they felt as though the messaging wasn't there, that people ignore it if they hear Category 1, which just has to do with wind strength. But the damage, a large part of that damage is coming from the rain. So those who are working on these predictions are focusing on that, being able to predict rain. But the tracking itself has much improved. That's the thing about hurricanes, that when we talk about sea level rise, there's one metric, or atmospheric warming, one metric. But hurricanes, you can talk about total rainfall, you can talk about winds, you can talk about sea level pressure, you can talk about storm surge. It's like there's all sorts of different, metrics to keep track of. But overall, it's improved. How's that for?
That's wonderful.
I got to the brief answer at the end.
What other questions do we have today from the audience?
I wouldn't actually go the route of engineering a safer place, because I don't. A lot of, particularly this neighborhood I'm thinking about, we tried to engineer a safer place. We put in a lot of culverts to rapidly pull water away from a particular development. Some of that, but it's still essentially and was always in the 100 and 500 year floodplain of a natural stream. So part of it is thinking through where our natural pathways of our waterways are, and preserving both their pathways, preserving it through the use of riparian buffers that can provide a whole range of benefits, including habitat around water filtering. So it's less, let's re-engineer and straighten this particular area. Because we've tried that. We tried that. I don't know how Duke's campus looks while it's raining, but
it's beautiful.
Oh, well, you could see that they did not provide, did not think through all of the development that was coming. So the motivation was to move the water as quickly as possible away from buildings. How do they do that? We smooth the way. We use a lot of concrete conveyances. However, as we add more and more impervious surface, we create more and more stormwater. It can't move as quickly. Even if it does move as quickly, it's doing damage through downcutting, through erosion of our waterways. So we have to actually think, how do we maintain our ecosystems as they stand, and not think that we could engineer around it enough that we could put a house there, which is what we've done. Instead, thinking, what are the many maybe it's 200 feet of buffer. That's a really wide one that I'm pushing for. But maybe we are buffering the natural waterways that far, and then saying, okay, then we'll start thinking about development. This is the same kind of conversation that Ian McHarg has around sand dunes. His work is that, not saying that we have to abandon being able to live close to our oceans. Water is culturally a part of so much of our history for any number of cultural identities. Instead, it's how do we live in harmony with nature? How do we protect those natural resources while still being able to reap some of the social benefits that we desire? It's more thinking about how do we live in balance versus constantly we can force nature to do as we please.
For somebody leaving this room today, where can they start looking for, if they want to get involved in something? What kinds of words should they search for on their town website? How does someone participate in this?
I think one of the most powerful getting to that kind of community effort it's called a CERT team, just like the little breath mints. It's Community Emergency Research Response Team. Most people in any type of an event, the person, I have immense respect for our first responders. They do amazing work, but there's not enough of them. For many folks, the person who is going to help, the person who's going to save your life, is the person closest to you. It's your neighbor. It's the people you work with. CERT team and CERT trainings allow you to better understand how to respond in those situations, to have and create that network so that it's established ahead of time. It's not trying to say, who in my neighborhood has a chainsaw the day of, versus collectively, where are our resources? How are we going to plan together about, in these smaller enclaves, how we can do the work? And most CERT teams are locally. It's not just one person goes through CERT training. Most of the time, they try to recruit a number of people from neighborhoods. So we're going to have a core within our neighborhood. It might be my homeowners association. It might be my church. It might be other volunteer organizations that have nothing to do with disaster preparedness that are still mobilized. After Katrina in particular, this idea of preparing for the zombie apocalypse was a method of saying, how do I get people thinking of this in outside of hurricane season? How do I think through my social network? And that was particularly tilted towards mobilizing millennials, trying to use The Walking Dead to motivate. But the zombie apocalypse has preparing for the zombie apocalypse will also help you be prepared in some cases for a lot of these natural hazards, in thinking through who's on my zombie apocalypse team. What are our skills? What are our materials? How are we going to communicate? Where are we going to muster, either in the neighborhood or elsewhere? All the things that we tell people to do, but we often push to the back of our minds because it's uncomfortable. So thinking through not just individually, but who would you recruit within your circle to go through this training with you.
Thank you again to both of our panelists.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.